During the course of this series, when it comes to the books of the Book of Mormon, I've talked about a number of literary issues that are related particularly to the move from Harmony, Pennsylvania through to Fayette, New York. There should be no reason why the location that the Book of Mormon is dictated should change the nature of the text, but that is the case. We've talked about the therefore, wherefore vernacular that changes in the transition from Harmony through to Fayette. We've talked about the second person narrative, which I think is related to Joseph now being connected to a lot of those letters back and forth with the extended Smith family. We've broached the anti-Catholic material that only seems to come up in the Fayette period of the dictation sequence, and also the heavy reliance on Isaiah as a mechanism to impart Old Testament scripture into particularly the replacement text. I've talked about these things on a number of different podcasts, and yet nobody else seems to be talking about them, and they are huge parts of the Book of Mormon and its makeup, and is completely ignored by anybody actually looking at the Book of Mormon, and I'm not entirely sure why. But for the next part of this series, I want to look at more of these literary features which define the Book of Mormon that suggest that it can't possibly be a history because of the ways that these literary devices turn up in the text. So if you have some that you want me to talk about, please give me a comment and let me know, and I will start to go through them. I've got a number that I've identified, but there are probably others that I haven't even usually talk about. So if there's something that really stands out to you as a quirky little literary thing about the Book of Mormon which you find strange, let's give those a mention. We've talked a lot about the idea that the Book of Mormon shouldn't change because of the location of Joseph Smith, that where he is shouldn't make a difference to what is in the text, but it does. The opposite problem is that the Book of Mormon text should change, because we're talking about 1,000-year time period with multiple different people involved, and so it should look and feel different in various parts of it. But this also doesn't happen. This is called univocal, and the Book of Mormon is univocal. It speaks with one voice in very similar ways across the whole text. The Bible, on the other hand, is not univocal. You can read different things in different eras, and because the people are real people recording in different centuries, you will get different ideas, different text, different textual analysis, different understandings, and certainly different political influences for what's being written down. The Book of Mormon is in essentially three parts. We have the replacement text at the beginning, which is the record of Nephi and Jacob, and then we have the next bit from Mosiah through to 4th Nephi, which is the abridgment of Mormon, and then we have the abridgment of Moroni for the Jaredite nation, which is a couple of thousand years prior, and so there should be kind of at least three really important parts that you can tell are completely different. Not to mention the hundreds of years with other authors where you should be able to see significant issues that are coming up with people, because life is just not univocal. It isn't the same all of the time. But what we see instead is the same issues coming up, the same excuses that the text makes to the reader. And there are a few of these, but the one I'll focus on today is 100th part. The idea that the authors and the abridgers of the Book of Mormon suggest that the reason why there's not more information is that it just can't be recorded. This is 100th part of what is actually going on. Here it is in Jacob chapter 3 in the replacement text. Here it is in 3rd Nephi 26 after Jesus has come. Here it is in 3rd Nephi chapter 5 before Jesus has come. Here it is in Helaman chapter 3 with the understanding of the wars. Here it is in Words of Mormon after the replacement text done by Mormon. And here it is again in Ether with the Jaredite record, which is supposed to be abridged by Moroni. These all say the same thing, and that is that whoever is dealing with the original records and history cannot record even 100th of what is actually going on. If you're interested in this, I did a whole podcast related to this called the Book of Mormon Clickbait with Mormonish. It's episode 228. And it goes over a number of features where the text excuses the idea that it is not quite in a full account. It's an abridgment. It's something that needs to be expanded on, and that you will get the rest if you are righteous enough. And so cleverly, the text pulls you into this idea that you want more and more, and that you're waiting for more, and maybe that there's some kind of hidden understanding underneath the text, that the words can convey hidden meanings if you're open to it. And that is the beauty of the catch that the Book of Mormon offers. Now, at this point, it's probably due for a shameless plug for my own book, Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism, a topical biography. Because one of the things that I endeavor to show, and that I believe that I've done so again and again in multiple chapters of the book, is that the Book of Mormon is univocal, and it addresses 19th century issues that Joseph is having in his present environment. Things like American exceptionalism, patriarchy, separation of church and state, the idea of slavery, the idea of white supremacy, the understanding of Indians and their place in the Americas, including missionary work and extermination or scattering, which end up being genocide. 19th century theological questions, particularly ones that are happening within the Smith family. Specific prejudices that Joseph has because of his poverty and his status in Western New York, and how that is implemented into the text. And most importantly, the whole folk magic culture of New England that Western New York refugees had, and that exhibit in the text as Joseph is living them. The book consistently documents all of these things, but it does much more. It goes on to show how this is then implemented in the early church in Joseph Smith's life, and then how it morphs because of its impact with reality that causes some conflict, and it means that Joseph has to pivot. So what we see is the church by Nauvoo being quite different from the early Ohio church, and particularly different from the Book of Mormon, which mirrors his environment and his understanding and his concerns as a 23-year-old in Western New York and also in Harmony, Pennsylvania. I believe I substantiate the claim that the Book of Mormon is Joseph, his worldview, his understanding, his mandate and manifesto for the future, that he believes that if things change in these certain ways, that America will be great, and that the people around him will be blessed. And because it makes that link between Joseph and the Book of Mormon, you can then see that link between Joseph and the Nauvoo church, and that helps to explain what it is we currently have and the emphases that we get from places like the Book of Mormon and from the doctrine and theological developments that end up in Nauvoo. These all speak to a univocal Book of Mormon because Joseph is the source, and it also speaks to the understanding that the topics are these 19th century influences that are actually happening to Joseph in the moment, with the people around him mirroring their present concerns. So that's just a convoluted way of saying that if you want to understand the Book of Mormon, you really have to understand Joseph Smith and his present circumstance. He is the univocal voice that is speaking during the text. How can we prove that Joseph is creating the Book of Mormon, and what mechanisms is he using that identifies and evidences this? For me, the best example of narrative crafting that shows a composition method and an ability to break that down is the story of Zeniff in the Book of Mosiah. It occupies 2 chapters in the current Book of Mormon, chapters 9 and 10. And if you lay them out side by side, you can see some really interesting things in the way that the text is laid out. Mosiah 9 and Mosiah 10 are the same skeletal outline. They follow the same narrative arc in the same order with the same wording in such a way that when you put them side by side, you can see exactly how this narrative is created. It cleverly often uses the same exact wording, but it manages to do it in such a way that they feel like completely different stories. It's incredibly clever and shows a high degree of sophistication. There are at least 30 points that you can cross over in the same order with the same trajectory and often exactly the same phrases. It has a beginning and an end that are slightly different, but convey the same kinds of ideas. And each chapter has a different tangent that features in a different part of the sequence that aligns with the same kind of ideas, but in a slightly different way, making the chapters feel quite different, even though they are side by side in the current Book of Mormon. What this means is that the narrative is crafted. It's 30 plus points which have been memorized and then spoken into existence in such a way that it rolls off the tongue in a story type way and makes it feel novel, even though it's the same story repeated. This is the kind of thing an oral performer does because he knows his material so well and his points in order and his punchlines such that he can create a story around them and it can feel novel almost every single time. It's just when you compare them side by side that you see that they are crafted from the same points. Now, this happens numerous times in the Book of Mormon, including this example in Mosiah 22, where you can see in the same chapter the same points being repeated again. And what's clever about this is that when you're doing a narrative, Joseph seems to do them in order so that they repeat the same story points in the same order. But if he's doing a sermon, he often repeats the points backwards, making it into a chiasm. This is a clever literary device for a number of reasons. One is that it allows him to repeat stories, repeat sermons, and get some kind of narrative arc, which is quite clever. But also it means that he can learn one thing and it give multiple results, multiple content. And we see these repeated stories transverse different parts of the Book of Mormon, so that we know that this is a narrative style which is being used by Joseph, who's the dictator, rather than the abridgers. We see this in Mosiah 9 and 10, which is side by side, and we see it later in Alma with the experiences of Ammon the missionary and Aaron the missionary in Alma chapters 18 and 22. But we also see it with King Noah in Mosiah and King Replakesh in Ether. And we see it with the stories of Korihor in Alma chapter 30 and Sherem in Jacob chapter 7. When you line up these stories side by side, you see the same points in the same order with the same narrative structure and the same result of the lesson of the narrative. You can also do this with whole chapters. The Book of Ether you can find by comparing verses in the Book of Mormon proper. Ether is just a Reader's Digest version where Joseph rehashes the same information that he has done with the greater Book of Mormon into a narrative arc for the Jaredite people. They have a migration, they split into two rival nations, they have kings that are fighting, and they end with total destruction and annihilation. Funnily enough, they do so on the same hill in western New York called the Hill Cumorah, or with the Jaredites, the Hill Ra. The fact that these repeated stories transverse the parts of the Book of Mormon that Mormon is supposed to have abridged, that Moroni is supposed to have abridged, and the parts that were created by Nephi and Jacob suggest that it's the same person employing these same literary skills. And to the scribes, this seems miraculous because Joseph can kind of just speak and create content really quickly, with these repeated stories. Joseph is also doing this at the same time in the Doctrine and Covenants revelations, and you can take those early revelations and see that he's repeating the same core in order to get his message across. Even though the revelations are to different people, he can utilize the same material again and again. This is a brilliant piece of narrative crafting, but it is an incredibly big tell that this is created in the moment by Joseph. One of the other areas of repeated content in the Book of Mormon is the type scenes. These are significant narrative structures that give weight to what is going on in the Book of Mormon as it progresses. We've already talked about a number of these, including the idea of 4 sons of Lehi, 4 sons of Mosiah, 4 sons of Jacob in different parts of the Book of Mormon. The idea of an acquisition of the records, the brass plates for Lehi, the gold jaredite plates for Mosiah, and then the jaredite plates again in Ether, as well as significant seer roles for people like Lehi and Nephi, for Mosiah, and also for the brother of Jared. There is also a repeated type scene for the idea of prophets being warned and fleeing, people like Lehi, Nephi, Mosiah, Alma, Ether. These are all people who are warned in a dream by God to flee the place that they are in order to save the people and have safety. There's also type scenes with regard to migration. We have Lehi leaving Jerusalem, coming to the New World. We have Mosiah leaving the land of Nephi-Lehi and coming to Zarahemla. We have Zenith going back to the land of Nephi for inheritance. We have the Jaredites leaving the old world and coming to the new world again. So these are all migration stories, and these are all type scenes as well. Joseph also does this with the text of the Book of Mormon, and you can tell because he uses the same phrases in various parts, and they seem to link in kind of cohesive ways. They're less structured than these repeated stories, but they still give some really interesting developments. One of my favorites is this one in Mosiah chapter 20. They fought for their lives and for their wives and for their children, and therefore they exerted themselves like dragons did they fight. I love that Joseph is employing a mythical creature here, dragons, and linking them to fighting for their lives. And then he uses that type scene again for Alma 43. They did fight like dragons, but they were fighting for their homes and their liberties and their wives and their children. And then later in that account, it says the Lamanites were not more numerous, yea, by more than double the number of the Nephites. Nevertheless, they were driven. When Joseph uses that type scene again in Mormon chapter 2, he exclaims they're fighting for their wives and their children and their houses and their homes, just like the other two. But then he's also suggesting that they're contending with an army of 30,000 against an army of 50,000. So almost half, that kind of idea that they're greatly outnumbered. These passages seem to indicate that Joseph has got some things in his head and he can kind of mix and match when he wants to get various iterations of the same kind of thing, but they feel or look a little different. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the book of Ether, where there's a type scene regarding the kings, that they are put into captivity, that they have a child in old age, that old aged child then comes and rescues his father and is put onto the throne, and then that is the new king. There seems to be about 5 storylines, but each generation might only include 3 of those storylines, and they're just different 3 each time, which means that the progression of generations goes through these kings, but they all seem to do the same kind of thing all over again, just 3 out of these 5 kind of type scenes. This kind of mix and match type scene production means that he can repeat type scene stories and get content while it feels familiar because it's the same kinds of ideas, but they're being regurgitated in slightly different ways, so to preserve some uniqueness. This also happens with sermons because he's able to relate a whole sermon, but then later when he's re-relating that same idea, and it's also influenced by the different household that he's in front of, he gets slightly different ideas that he's able to connect. And so it feels a little bit different, even though it's using the same base. The repeated ideas do make the text a little bit boring and repetitive, but that is also one of the geniuses of the Book of Mormon. It reinforces the same things again and again, so you get them and feel like they're strong because they have been reiterated a number of times. But it does also mean that if you just went with one of those ideas rather than the 3 or 4 iterations, you would have a tiny Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon text has some significant number issues in that the people that it describes can't physically exist in the natural world. One of the issues that becomes a big deal in the Book of Mormon is the chain of custody, the idea that the plates are handed down from generation to generation so that it gets to Moroni and then ends up in the hands of Joseph Smith. Joseph wants to legitimize the record by suggesting that it is an artifact, that it is in fact real, that people have handled it. But when you look at the record keepers in the Book of Mormon, there are 16 generations in the 1,000-year time period, which makes an average generation of 60 years. As we've talked about before, this is impossible because generations are 20 to 25 years, not 60 years. People are not having children at 60 years old and then passing the records to them going forward infinitum over the course of 1,000 years. While men can have children at 60, most of them don't because their wives can't have children at 60. There is no mechanism in the text that explains it except for the idea that Joseph doesn't know what a generation is. He's just counting it as the age of a man, the age that he might be able to connect with another person, in which case this is what's written into the Book of Mormon, and Joseph has got it completely wrong. We know this because in the parts of the Book of Mormon that talk about prophecy of 3 or 4 generations passing away, the time frame that Joseph is using is this 180 to 240 year time, which is 3 to 4 generations. But really, 3 to 4 generations should be about 100 years, not 180 or close to 200 years. There are just too few authors of the Book of Mormon to warrant the time frame. And related to this is population growth, because we see throughout the text there's times when the amount of people that are talked about can't possibly have existed. 2 Nephi chapter 5 talks about Nephi splitting the family by taking those people with him. These are like 10 to 12 people, and this is 570 years before Christ. But these people are fashioning iron, they're working buildings, they're dealing with steel and gold, all kind of smeltering techniques, which require huge populations of people, but also an incredibly high amount of industry and ability. You just can't do that with 10 to 12 people. And by the time that Jacob is talking about the next line of kings practicing polygamy, this is only another 30 years. This is maybe 10 to 20 couples practicing complex polygamy. This is not possible with the amount of people that could even possibly have been generated by this point in the story. And with regard to wars, we see tens of thousands of people dying all the time, including major battles by the end of the Book of Mormon, where hundreds of thousands of people are dying. And this is just not possible from the amount of people that started off in the Americas with Lehi or with the Mulekites. This is why apologists have to state that there are people there already, but they're not in the historic record. And when the Mulekites turn up, that's a really big deal. This problem is exacerbated in the Book of Ether, where there are now millions of people getting slaughtered at the very end of their civilization, and all this while they've had a number of extinction issues and events during the wars of the kings along their line. This is just not feasibly possible. Joseph is imagining thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people out of thin air. He has no concept of population growth, of the idea of genetics and intermingling families, and he has no idea about what a generation is. This is pure imagination. And because hundreds of thousands and millions of people have died around the hill Cumorah, according to the Book of Mormon, we should find archaeological evidence for that. And of course, there is none. So therefore, apologists need to make an argument that the hill Cumorah is not the hill Cumorah. It is just a type of one that was completely somewhere else in the Americas. There are so many excuses for why the text does not match up with any archaeological evidence of the kinds of people that should be there, because the text says that they are. This makes the Book of Mormon a fantasy, a Christian adventure story, not an actual civilization. Another very odd literary feature of the Book of Mormon is that the type of civilization that is described in the text mirrors exactly an early 19th century America, not an ancient one. The text of the Book of Mormon describes a domestication of animals and plants that didn't exist before Europeans came to the Americas. It includes sheep, goats, horses, and even flocks that are being domesticated and used by the civilizations in the Book of Mormon. But the ancient American people did not domesticate animals. In fact, there's only one animal in the whole of the Americas that has been domesticated, and that is the llama. Domestication of animals is a really big deal, and there's only a tiny percentage of the whole of the animal species on the world that have the right characteristics that you're able to then domesticate them. One of the reasons that indigenous Americans were wiped out by major diseases is because of domestication of animals. In Europe, where people and animals are side by side, those infections from animals jump to people, and in people they can be incredibly deadly. Europeans had developed a resistance to such diseases. But the American people, they didn't have these. Because they didn't have domestication of animals, they also didn't have their own plagues that would then infect the Europeans and cause them to be in a lot of problems. In fact, there's only one disease in the Americas that then transferred to Europe, and that was syphilis. But diseases like smallpox that came from Europe wiped out thousands, millions of indigenous Americans. And the animals that are native to America are not seen in the Book of Mormon. It really is a European-centric text. This is also the case with plants, that all of the plants mentioned in the Book of Mormon are European-centric texts, except for corn. Corn was grown in America, but then it transferred to Europe and then back to the Americas. The text of the Book of Mormon correlate to a civilization that exists in Joseph's world that could not have existed in ancient America. And the kinds of things that were in ancient America are not described in the text. These anachronisms show that this is a 19th century work, not an ancient one. There are some clever ways that you can check the Book of Mormon for 19th century influence. Early America was marked by the printing press. It was in every town and city in the United States. Shipping brought books back and forth from the European continent, and people were reading incessantly periodicals, newspapers, books, anything. People were printing things en masse. This feature of modern society is the backbone of the Book of Mormon that teaches that the righteous religious word is codified in text, and that it makes it sacred, but it also protects it from corruption. And the Lamanites, who are the savages in the Book of Mormon, they have lost their way because their oral traditions have been corrupted. And to be fair, this new technology was advantaging Europeans above Native Americans at the time. especially when extinction events like diseases would decimate tribes and get rid of their transmission of oratory knowledge from one generation to another. The written word offered stability and reliability. Ancient Americans did not have a written language, and so the Book of Mormon itself is an anachronistic text. But one of the things we have looked at already is the idea of a univocal Book of Mormon, the idea that the people, the purported authors of the text, speak in the same kinds of ways, and they have the same phrases. Here are a number of examples from the Book of Mormon that transverse centuries and yet have exact same phrases. One of the tools you can use on Google is a feature called Ngram, where you can put phrases in and check text of books for hundreds of years and look at their prevalence of those phrases coming up in the ways that people are writing of the time. And when you do that with phrases from the Book of Mormon, you find that those phrases were common in the texts that were produced of the time. And lots of those have fallen out of favor as they've got through into the 20th and 21st centuries. Here are a number of examples that show that some of these phrases in the Book of Mormon were at their height of use around about the time that the Book of Mormon was published. This suggests that Joseph is borrowing wording from his surroundings. These are not words that he's getting from some ancient source that's been delivered by a stone in a hat through the eyes and mechanism of God, but that he is interpreting stuff that is in his common environment, and that is what is coming out his mouth. Which, even if you believe that the Book of Mormon is divine, suggests that Joseph is an author. We're only talking about whether he's an author in terms of the words that are being used, or whether he's the author in terms of the ideas that are being used. But there is no doubt that Joseph is contributing to the text of the Book of Mormon. And we can evidence the phrases of the Book of Mormon that they are coming from the 19th century environment that Joseph is producing the Book of Mormon in. The text is dependent on its 19th century environment and on Joseph's vernacular. This user asks a great question. How about the different grammar and vernacular used in the Book of Mormon? For example, in the 1830 edition, there are sentences in American Appalachian English, saying things like, I was a journeying, I was a going, things that are very colloquial American English sayings. It's really important to understand that the Book of Mormon went through some significant editorial review and production. It's been highly polished over the years to improve spelling, grammar, and the ability to make changes where there are definite mistakes. Many people suggest that the Book of Mormon is miraculous because it is dictated in such a short space of time, with some estimates suggesting that there are 65 working days in the months of April, May, and June of 1829, which cover about 90 days. But if you take a slow dictation speed of 100 words per minute, this equates to about 45 hours of text, which means that this can easily be done with an hour to 2 hours in that time frame. In fact, in any given day, Joseph can spend significant time thinking about what is going to be said that day and then take the time to dictate it. It may not all have been in one go either. It might have been in patches of 10 or 15 minutes or half an hour, in which case you could easily do 2 to 3 hours worth of work a day and still have plenty of the rest of the day. Here's a page from the original manuscript, and you can see it's packed densely with text. But it's just one run-on sentence. There is no punctuation whatsoever. You can even see that there are some additions into the text, some cross-outs. This was a work in progress. The printer's manuscript is a lot tidier, and you can see that it still has no sentence structure and it has no punctuation, but it does look a lot better. After the original manuscript was produced, Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith spent months producing the printer's manuscript in this much more careful and beautiful way. This was delivered to the printer, who then took the pages home to put in sentences, to put in punctuation, to correct spelling errors, and this was what was produced for the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. Here's the text laid out in that edition with punctuation, with paragraphs, with sentences, in a way that the reader can read it in some orderly fashion. All of this work, including the printing, took 6 months, twice the time frame of actually producing the text of the Book of Mormon. Look at some of these changes in the subsequent editions. Here's the 1837 edition next to the 1830 edition. This is from 1 Nephi chapter 11, adding in the words "the Son of God" in order to make the text mean that God and Jesus are separate individuals. Prior to this, in the 1830 edition, Jesus was God. And here's another change in the 1837 edition of the Book of Mormon, where Joseph changed King Benjamin to King Mosiah in a couple of places, because this didn't make any sense if it was Benjamin, and made much more sense if it was Mosiah. And look at this change in 1840, where the title page of the Book of Mormon was changed to make more sense. While it's technically correct that the Book of Mormon was done in one draft and basically it's the same, these additions and changes to the text, the editing, the polishing of the narrative, the changing of the vernacular, these are all incredible enhancements to the text that make you feel like it was quite polished at the time when actually it was quite rough. And while the vast majority of the changes from the original text are spelling and grammar and punctuation, there are these theological changes which make a huge deal to the evolution of the church as Joseph is participating in it and as the church moves forward in Ohio and then in Nauvoo. This is all worthwhile considering when we think about whether the Book of Mormon is miraculous as a text or it's quite within the realms of human possibility to produce. While there are editing corrections to the text after it's being produced, there are also evidences of correction to the text while it's being produced. The Book of Mormon is an oral production, and Joseph is planning out what he's going to say, but what if he says something wrong in the moment? The scribes believe that he's reading this off his seer stone, so he needs to continue to read even to make the change and correct for the mistake. Here are some examples, and they're throughout the text. Alma chapter 10 says that I never have known much of the ways of the Lord, but then Joseph realizes that's not correct. So he says, I mistake, for I have seen much of his mysteries. This is not something he's written, because nobody would write this down. Either that or they would cross it out and then it would be correct. You wouldn't replace what you just said with something else unless it's an oratory production. Here's another in 1 Nephi chapter 8. Behold, I have dreamed a dream, or in other words, I have seen a vision. And this phrase, or in other words, is used throughout the text to clarify or correct what has just been said. Here's one in Alma chapter 40. Behold, I say unto you that there is no resurrection, or I would say, in other words, that this mortal does not put on immortality, this corruption does not put on incorruption till after the coming of Christ. And you can see there that idea of no resurrection, then realizing, oh no, there is a resurrection. Oh, but that is, I can clarify that or qualify it by being after the coming of Christ. And here's one from Alma chapter 24, that they buried their weapons of peace, and then he realizes that's incorrect, or they buried their weapons of war for peace. And there are times in the text that we've already talked about, like 3 Nephi 28, where he's finished dictating and realizing that he's made a mistake, and so he needs to come back and correct it. And in this case, in verse 37, it says, But behold, since I wrote, I have inquired of the Lord, and he hath made it manifest unto me that there must needs be a change wrought upon their bodies, meaning the 3 Nephites. This suggests that he's thought about it, or somebody has challenged him on the information that he's given, and he's made a correction that he needs to then put into the text. But if somebody was writing this thousands of years prior, they would have just crossed out what they had done before and just redone the new information, or stamped it out if it's on gold plates, all those kinds of things. But you can't do that if it's an oral production and it's rolling off your tongue as you have told other people that you're seeing in your seer stone. These textual aberrations are a great way to understand what is happening in the moment of oration as Joseph is dictating to his scribes. And along with all the other textual ideas that we have talked about, they all indicate that one person, Joseph, is making these things happen, and it's according to what he's doing that is what is recorded.